In this example, I'm going to explain how you use a method with parameters. So this particular program is going to calculate the number of buses needed for a school trip. And it's going to do that by dividing the number of pupils by the capacity of each bus. So the first thing we need to do is we need to create two variables. One to store the number of pupils and one to store the capacity of each bus. So I want to declare two int variables and we're going to initialize those to 0. Next thing we need to do is we need to ask the user to enter the number of pupils going on the school trip, and we're going to store that in the number of pupils. So we've set the number of pupils equal to convert to int16 console.readline. So what's happening here is this console.readline is reading in from the console the number of pupils going on the trip. But remember, each user input is read in as a string, and you need to store this as an int so that you can use it in a calculation. So what you have to do is you have to put this wrapped around the console.readline to convert it to a number. It's converted to a number, then it's stored in the number of pupils variable. Next, we ask the user to enter the number of pupils that each bus can take in the trip. Same idea. You're going to read the figure in. It's then going to convert it to an int, and then it's going to store it in the capacity of buses. Next thing we need to do is we need to create a variable to store the number of buses. Now this variable is going to store the value which is going to be returned by the method used to calculate the number of buses needed. So we declare a number of buses variable as an int and set it equal to 0. Now obviously you can't have a decimal number of buses. It has to be a whole number, and if you do get a decimal value in a calculation, if we store it as an int, it normally rounds it up. But we're not going to worry about that just now. So next we set the number of buses, which is the variable you've just created and initialized to 0. You're going to set it equal to, and then you call the method. So this particular method is going to send the number of pupils that the user has put in and the capacity of buses that the user has put in. It's going to send both of those, a bit like ingredients if you like. Now they're actually called parameters or variables. They're going to send those parameters or variables to the method call. This is the method call, and this method then has been set up that it requires two bits of information in order to do the calculation it needs to do. One is the number of pupils and the other is the capacity of the buses. So in the method signature you need to include the data type and then the name of the variable. So this particular method requires two bits of information in order to do what it needs to do. Now, if you remember from the previous video, I talked about static and void. Now, we're not going to explain what static does at this point in time, but you'll notice void has been replaced by an int, and void simply refers to a return type. And a void return type, if I put void in here, it would mean that this method maybe does something but doesn't return a value to the method that called it. Now this particular method does return a value. It returns an int value. So in other words, whatever calculation this does, this method is going to send the value back to replace the calling method. So in other words, whatever value is calculated here will replace the value in here, which will subsequently be set equal to the number of buses. So the number of buses will be set equal to the value returned as a result of this calculation. So to do the calculation, we're going to create a variable, an int variable called num_buses, and we're simply going to divide the number of pupils by the capacity of the buses. And then we're going to return this, the result of this calculation, to the method that called it. So if we just run that, so how many pupils are going on the school trip? Let's say it's 234, and the capacity of the buses is 50, and this trip will require 4 buses. Now it hasn't rounded up on this occasion, but that's not really important for the purposes of this particular demonstration. There is another I guess concept that you have to use. That's called casting, and we'll learn about that later in the video demonstrations. So just to summarize, we've used a method call, but this particular method call now is sending parameters or passing parameters to a method, and this method, the method that you set up, must have the same number of parameters as the passing method. So in other words, if you pass it 2 methods, this method here must be set up to accept 2 parameters. Also, if you want to return a variable, instead of having static void calculate number of buses, you need to then indicate the return type, in other words the data type of the variable that you wish to return. I wish to return to the method that called it an int. An int is the result, the int num_buses is the result of the number of pupils divided by the capacity of the buses. So have a go at that.